Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to Manchester Community College and our annual Constitution Day lecture. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce to you today our guest speaker, Attorney Richard Voigt, who will speak on the big gamble, Article 6 and the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Mr. Voigt has recently retired from his position as a partner in the law firm of McCarter and English in Hartford. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree with honors from Wesleyan University in 1968 and his Juris Doctorate degree from the University of Virginia Law School in 1972. At McCarter and English, Mr. Voigt represented employers in a wide variety of employment-related matters, including wrongful discharge cases, employment discrimination cases, state and federal court injunction actions, breach of contract cases, and NLRB unfair labor practice proceedings. He has been a frequent speaker on labor and employment issues and was recognized as a Chambers USA Leaders in Their Field lawyer in employment and labor law for 2009-2015. He was also listed in the Best Lawyers in America and Super Lawyers in Connecticut. I'm very honored to be able to introduce to you today Richard Voigt. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me okay? I always like it when people applaud before they've heard anything I've said, so I appreciate that. And I apologize, I'm so far from you, but because of COVID protocols, I'm up here a distance from you, and I hope that you can hear me and follow me. Whether you know it or not, all of us in this room are involved in an ongoing experiment, an ongoing gamble. Each one of us, in his or her own way, is having an effect on the outcome. Sometimes the effects may be small, but if you add them all up, in the aggregate, the effects can be very significant. Whether you know it or not, the stakes in this experiment, in this gamble, are really big. Not just for us, but for the generations who come after us. If this gamble is lost, the lives of every one of us and those who come after us will be changed in some way. Living in America will never be the same. Now, I realize I might sound a little melodramatic, and some of you may think, boy, he's exaggerating things, going over the top. But when I look around the world today, when I consider history, when I consider recent events in this country, I don't think I'm very far off the mark. What's the experiment? What's the gamble? The basic concept is relatively simple, but it's extremely difficult to implement it. The experiment, the gamble, is that can you take people of widely different ethnic backgrounds, widely different religious and political beliefs, widely different lifestyles, and put them together in one nation in which people will be free to pursue those beliefs and lifestyles without government control, without government coercion, without the nation eventually ripping itself apart. Whether you know it or not, whether you appreciate it or not, there's never been a nation like America in the history of the planet in which so many people of differing religious, racial, ethnic, and political backgrounds live and work shoulder to shoulder in relative peace with broad political and personal freedoms. Never been a country like it. In significant measure, we owe our fortunate but fragile democracy to the United States Constitution. In particular, Article 6 of the Constitution, and to the original Constitution, and then the First Amendment to the Constitution, which came after the original Constitution was drafted and enacted. Now, I know for many people the Constitution is viewed as a legal document, which seems to be of greatest interest to lawyers and judges who earn their livings by arguing about what the Constitution means. But make no mistake about it. Article 6 and the First Amendment are not simply the source of legal principles and esoteric legal arguments. They're also a source of a bold moral vision. They're also a source of a shrewd political philosophy that all of us depend on to live the way we do. What I'm going to do today is briefly discuss the history of Article 6 and the First Amendment, and then I'll discuss why they're so important to us and why they represent a gamble. This is not a political speech. I'll do my best to avoid politics. I have criticisms of people on the extreme left and the extreme right. And my criticisms, some of which I'm going to share with you, are not directed toward their policy positions on health care or taxes or anything like that. My criticisms refer to their apparent disregard or lack of appreciation for the fundamental American values that are expressed in the Constitution. It's increasingly difficult, and I've given this speech at Manchester before, and I've really appreciated the invitation from Professor Masori to come here to share my thoughts. And every year I say, this is not a political speech, and I try my damnedest not to inject politics in this. But I'm going to be honest with you, it's increasingly difficult to avoid something that has the shade of a political commentary in it. And that's, in large measure, referring to today's speech, the events of January 6th present me with a pretty big challenge of how to avoid being political, or what appears to be political in this speech. But I'll do my best. All right, let's turn to a brief historical context for Article 6 in the First Amendment, just to give you that history and put it in perspective. When people talk about the founding of America, they usually refer to the arrival of the European settlers because the various legal documents, including the U.S. Constitution, flow from the appearance of those people on the shores of America. Native Americans didn't have a written constitution. There was no written history, so it's hard to refer to how they dealt with these issues in the detail in which ultimately they were expressed in the Constitution. So by necessity, I'm going to be referring to this period of settlement from people who came from Europe. And usually that story starts when people do a history of America with the arrival of so-called pilgrims or Puritans who formed colonies in Massachusetts, Plymouth colony being the most notable. And the story typically was that they were seeking religious freedom. That's why they came to America. And it's a good way to start the story. Except that in the way that we think of religious freedom and the way that the Constitution thinks of religious freedom, that's not what they were about. What they were about was religious freedom for themselves, so that they would be free to practice the religion of their choice, which was a form of Protestantism. But they had no interest in tolerating other religions in their midst. So as a result, in 1635, they expelled Roger Williams from the colony. And anybody know where Roger Williams went after he was thrown out of Massachusetts? Yes, exactly. He went and founded, at the time it was called Providence Plantation, but he went and founded a new colony, Rhode Island, where there was religious freedom compared to Massachusetts. In 1660, Quakers were hanged in Plymouth Colony for being heretics, not accepting the beliefs of the Puritans in the colony. Only 4 colonies of the original 13, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island, did not have a state-established church. In other words, a church that was supported by government money, endorsed by the government, was the official religion. All of those colonies except one, the official religion, if you will, was Christianity of the Protestant stripe. There was one colony where Catholicism was the official religion of the colony. Anyone guess which colony that was? Maryland. So Maryland was Catholic, all the rest were Protestant. In 1649, Maryland enacted called an Act of Toleration. And what they were saying was, we Catholics in Maryland will tolerate other religions within a certain defined category. It was by our grace, our discretion, our exercise or limitation on our own power will let you practice your religion so long as, and this is what they were tolerating, they would tolerate religious rights of all persons professing to believe in Jesus Christ, which is another way of saying that they would tolerate Protestants, they wouldn't tolerate Islamists. They were called Mohammedans in those days. They wouldn't tolerate Jews. But even with regard to Protestants, it was an act of toleration. Fast forward to 1784, Thomas Jefferson, living in the colony, ultimately become a state. At that point, I think it was a state of Virginia, drafted what was known as the Statute of Religious Liberty. And that provided religious freedom in Virginia. It wasn't enacted until 1786. At that time, Jefferson was actually ambassador, U.S. ambassador to France. He wasn't there for its passage, but he drafted it. It was opposed by Patrick Henry in Virginia. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, thought that Christianity should be the official religion of Virginia. Even George Washington thought that money should be used to support a state church. Tax dollars, there should be a state church. He was very concerned if you opened it up to all religions, that would be chaotic. Now we go to 1787. We're now at the point where the Constitution is being drafted. The U.S. Constitution is being drafted. And in that drafting, the drafters decided to insert Article 6 in the Constitution. It's an oddly worded article. I'm going to read it to you. The Constitution and laws of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Everybody's got to follow the Constitution. The senators and representatives and members of the several state legislatures and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, meaning just about every political official in the country, shall be bound by an oath or affirmation to support the Constitution. But no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any public office or public trust under the United States. It was very difficult to get Article 6 adopted. Why? Because the Protestants in particular. There was this battle between the Catholics and the Protestants, and the Protestants accused the Catholics that they would not have primary allegiance to the government of the United States, to the Constitution. Their primary allegiance would be to the Pope. And so they worked out this compromise. That's why it has this odd language. It starts out about oath-giving, and then the big substantive provision comes at the end. And they said, if we can require everybody to take an oath to support the Constitution, and in those days an oath was a sacred undertaking, then we can trust as best as possible that everybody who holds public office, in fact, their primary allegiance will be to the United States and to the Constitution, not to some other person, religious figure, political figure outside the country. And that's how they got it adopted. Now, the oath that is expected to be taken, at least by the president, they put in the Constitution. It's in Article 2, Section 1, and it reads as follows. This is the oath for the president. And that's how concerned they were that they get this right, because of the fear of chaos and failure of people to honor their obligations to the best interests of the United States. Quote, I do solemnly swear or affirm I will faithfully execute the office of President in the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. George Washington, in his inaugural, added at the end of that, so help me God. Ultimately, an oath was drafted for other officials, congressmen, senators, and representatives. And it reads, and it's much wordier, and you'll see what they were concerned about. This is developed in the 1860s. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter, so help me God. Why all the extra words in 1860? Anybody hazard a guess? What was going on in 1860 in this country? The Civil War started. And you had, sitting in Congress, people from Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, border states at that time. And at this time, the South had already seceded, had left. And people were worried that they were going to join the South. The country was splitting apart. And so they put this extra language in. What about the First Amendment? Now we turn to the First Amendment. Now, Article 6 was in the original Constitution. It's the only provision in the original Constitution that deals with individual rights. The rest of the original Constitution had provisions of how to organize a government. There would be a president, there would be a Senate, a House of Representatives, a Supreme Court, U.S. District Courts, all of the infrastructure of how to put a government together. That's what the Constitution, original Constitution, was about. And then come the amendments. People felt you needed to add something to that focused on individual rights. And the first 10 amendments are typically called the Bill of Rights. And the First Amendment, and some people think is the most important, focused on individual rights of people, citizens. And it reads as follows, very short, but talk about a few words having great impact. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition government for redress of grievances. That's the whole thing. By 1791, enough states had voted for it to be included as an amendment to the original Constitution. Connecticut did not vote for the First Amendment. And they were, as did Massachusetts, and Georgia. It was ratified by the other states, fortunately with a sufficient majority, large enough to get it into the Constitution. Connecticut finally voted for the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment in 1939, about 80 years ago. Now again, there were people who were very afraid, and we'll talk about, of the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. Just so you understand the history, remember it said Congress shall make no law. So originally it only applied to the federal government. State governments were still free to suppress free speech, suppress free exercise of religion, and in fact did so. Connecticut and Massachusetts continued to have state-supported churches, basically a Protestant church, until 1818. Massachusetts, 1833, so a number of years afterwards. And then finally, in the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights, in essence, was applied to all the states. So after the 14th Amendment, which is around the middle 1860s, you now have the First Amendment applying to both states and the federal government, and basically applying to any government activity. From the beginning, and that's why Connecticut didn't vote for it, it was the First Amendment in particular, but Article 6 as well, was viewed as a gamble. You can't give people all these freedoms. You can't let any religion come and set up shop and preach its creed, encourage people to join the church and adopt their beliefs, have people who have unusual or challenging political beliefs speak their mind freely, be able to publish newspapers and magazines, and the rest of it. The country will fall apart. It'll just split apart. You've got to have consistency, you have to have consensus, you have to have people thinking the same way. And so the opponents said, what this really is, what the First Amendment is, what Article 6 is a suicide pact. That's all it is. Eventually, the country will destroy itself as all these groups fight with each other, tear each other down, tear each other apart. But the idea that Article 6 and the First Amendment were a bold gamble was also a source of their power, that it was a big risk, and we were, as a country, willing to take it. That gamble captured the imagination of many Americans and people around the world. Even George Washington, who had his doubts about this, the more he thought about it, came around to a view that he thought that the First Amendment, Article 6, were a wise decision. So he expressed this view in a communication to the oldest Jewish synagogue in America. Anybody know where that is? Good guess, but it's actually Newport, Rhode Island, the Touro Synagogue. But South Carolina was a very good guess because they did have community there. And in his remarks, George Washington said this, and you can see from these remarks, he understood exactly what was different between the Toleration Act of 1649 in Maryland and the First Amendment and Article 6, and that this was something really different and good. He said it this way: all possess alike, referring to now the changes that had been enacted, all possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if by the indulgence of one class of people that another class enjoy the exercise of their natural rights. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land, referring to the Jewish congregation, continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. Now, fortunately, the typical First Amendment legal controversy, if you will, focuses on narrow technical issues, not a kind of fundamental challenge because it's in the Constitution. It's a given. And that's fortunate. And then a typical, again, I could do a semester course on just First Amendment law. So, but just to give you a quick example, recently, Enfield High School wanted to have their graduation ceremony at a large Christian church in Bloomfield because it was bigger, it could accommodate more people. I think this was before COVID, just before COVID. So it was just a size issue. Probably would be more of an issue with COVID. And some parents filed a lawsuit, said, hold it, that's a state sponsored function, public school, holding a graduation ceremony in a Christian church. That's an implicit endorsement of Christianity. That violates the First Amendment. And the court looked at the kind of the specifics and ultimately ruled that in fact it was a violation based on how the interior of the church was set up. There were lots of religious symbols, crosses, statues of Jesus, Virgin Mary, all around. And so it was pretty hard to sit in that graduation ceremony and not be reminded that this was a Christian venue. And so the court said, that's unfair to the people in the graduating class whose families were not Christian. That's the type of cases that we'll see. Again, there are many, many cases. Now, many people kind of subordinate the importance of these provisions to economic opportunity in America. You know, what makes America great is, you can go as far in this country as your hard work, your wits, your good luck can take you. That's economic opportunity that makes America great in what it is and should be admired for. And when the Constitution is considered at all, and many times it's not considered at all, it's in kind of a vague sort of way that, well, it's important, but it's not understood. It's something fundamental to the country. And to be sure, economic opportunity is important, but it doesn't explain why our country is so significant. Another way to describe the American experiment is whether the human race can find common ground in life's joys and struggles, common ground in the satisfaction of building a community instead of destroying it, whether we can celebrate rather than fear many of the differences among us. This is the true spirit of America that really sets us apart from other countries. And continues to attract people to come to this country who've lived their lives in fear and pain inflicted by homicidal ideologues, dictators, religious fanatics in other countries. In 2007, an Indian Muslim journalist, Hussein Zaidi, toured the United States, and he was stunned by what he saw here. He said, here, Shiite and Sunni Muslims were praying together in U.S. mosques. He said, quote, "It is something we never see at home. They want to kill each other everywhere except in the USA." In June of 2008, an Iranian, Hamad Batebi, arrived in the U.S. He was at age 38. He had escaped from Iran after 8 years of being held in Iranian prisons. And he was subject in the Iranian prison to torture. And then one of the psychological methods of torture that they used, they took him to the gallows twice, put a noose around his neck, did everything except pull the lever to hang him. But he thought he was going to die twice, right up until the last second. He escaped and ultimately made his way to Washington, D.C. And when he arrived at Dulles Airport outside of Washington, D.C., he couldn't believe what he saw as he looked out the window of his airplane. There on the ground directing the plane into the gate was a Muslim woman wearing a tight headscarf. She was on the ground running that operation. The New York Times reported, quote, Mr. Batebi was enthralled, sensing a casual tolerance that was exactly what he had longed for in his own country. It seems to me, this is Batebi, that people here are free to live their lives so long as they do no harm to anyone else. Now, under the First Amendment, the government can't use its power to suppress free speech or the exercise of religion. And, not surprisingly, because it's a gamble, and that results in a lot of strange, quirky, obnoxious ideas and beliefs being expressed. Jerks, if you will, in some cases psychopaths, if you will, speaking their mind, and the government, as long as they don't engage in criminal activity or violent activity, the government can't suppress that speech. Many countries, also religious beliefs as well, and makes it difficult to develop, and we're seeing this now, a national consensus on various issues where everybody's kind of pointed in the same direction. That's been historically the case with America for years. These ideas can promote unrest and division, and some people even advocate, that things should come apart. There are people, citizens of this country, who don't like the way this country is set up, and they want to see it broken up. Many countries are not willing to take this gamble. Russia, China, Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Zimbabwe, Nicaragua, North Korea, all of them suppress political dissent. And, in many cases, the free expression of religion. Even some Western democracies that are basically free societies are unwilling to take the gamble that America takes. Let's take the example of France. France has a substantial Muslim population. Why do you think that is? Why does France have so many people who believe in Islam, who live in France? Yes. Exactly. They had colonies. They were in North Africa. Morocco and Tunisia were French colonies, all Islamic, and a lot of those people immigrated to France, and they had kind of a claim to be able to immigrate to France. And as a result, there's a substantial Islamic population in France. And that's created tensions between the typical French population and Christian and the Islamic populations. So how did France try to deal with this tension? Their approach, in contrast to the First Amendment, was to suppress expression of religion, make everyone secular, non-religious, in certain venues. So in public schools, public buildings, no veils. This is illegal to wear a veil, a headscarf, a large cross, a large Star of David, no yarmulkes. You can't wear in a public building in France anything that displays your religious belief. Make everyone secular, suppress everything. In 2008, the French Council of State denied the petition for citizenship of a French Moroccan woman. Now, this was a fundamentalist Islamic woman who rejected the idea that she should vote, and voting should be left to her husband and male relatives. She wore a burqa. She was very conservative, fundamentalist Islamic. Her application for citizenship in France was denied. And in doing so, the Council of State stated that they're going to deny her petition because, quote, her total submission to her husband makes her insufficiently assimilated to France's ethos of gender equality. In 2009, the French president at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, gave an address to the French Parliament in which he said, quote, the burqa is the Islamic dress in which the body of a female is totally covered head to toe, is not welcome in French territory. In our country, we cannot accept that women be prisoners behind a screen, cut off from all social life, deprived of all identity. But the result was suppression of a religious expression. In August of 2018, the country of Denmark imposed fines of $150 to $1,500 to those who appear in public with their faces covered, which would effectively outlaw the burqa and other Islamic dress. Their rationale was that nothing in Islam requires veiling or veils to be worn. That's a cultural, not a religious symbol, and therefore they're going to suppress it. That's how they got around it. But in fact, in a practical manner, they were suppressing religion. In March of 2021, just a few months ago, Switzerland, in a national referendum, Swiss voters approved a ban on face coverings. You can't wear face coverings in Switzerland. Previously, a few years previously, the Swiss had approved a ban on the building of minarets. You can't build a minaret in Switzerland. A minaret is a typical architectural feature of a mosque, an Islamic mosque. Their approach, and these are basically free countries, but to suppress the open, free expression of religion in hopes of avoiding the kind of conflicts we've been talking about. Now, America's toleration of all these beliefs and behaviors obviously produces a complex, disorderly society in many ways. America's not a tidy country. Things aren't nicely, neatly organized and neat compartments. We're a messy country. That's built into the freedom. We're chaotic in many ways. And, blunt truth, dangerous to ourselves. Adolf Hitler, of the Nazis in Germany, was appalled by American society. He called it a mongrel society because of all of the mix of races and ethnic groups, religions, and political beliefs. And he said, in his view, America would fall apart and basically America, being a group of pound dogs, could never stand up to the purebred German shepherds that he was going to use. Although it was a serious miscalculation, obviously, some today, including in this country, hold a similar view. We'll see if I can read my notes through the water. Anyway, sorry about that. No doubt the range of beliefs expressed in America are unsettling, nerve-wracking. Here are just a few examples of beliefs that are tolerated under the First Amendment. Do any of you know the Westboro Church? Ever heard of the Westboro Baptist Church? Westboro Baptist Church believes that is opposed to homosexuality and believes that because America in various ways tolerates homosexual conduct and people who espouse support for various politically related issues to homosexual, gay marriage, for example, that God is and will punish America for this sin. And so what they do is they've cut back a little bit on this, but they're still doing something similar to that, to this. They go to military funerals, and they stand, and these are people who have died in Iraq, Afghanistan. These are military funerals. And they hold up signs, and they thank God for dead American soldiers. It's God's punishment. Thank God for AIDS. After 9/11, they held signs, thank God for 9/11. The Supreme Court held that peaceful presentation of those views, however obnoxious, was protected by the First Amendment. The National Socialist Movement, a neo-Nazi organization, in this case in Missouri, wanted to participate in an Adopt a Highway program. You've seen the Adopt a Highway program where a group will put a sign next to the road, they've adopted the highway, maybe the Lions Club or the Kiwanis, Chamber of Commerce. Well, the National Socialist Movement said, well, we should be able to put a sign up too, and get a section of the highway that we can have as our own, because it's a public highway. The government is running that program. The website and they wanted a half mile on Route 160 near Springfield, Missouri to be theirs. Their website says this, quote, only those of pure white blood who are not Jewish or gay can be citizens, and they demanded that all non-white citizens currently residing in America be required to leave the nation forthwith and return to their lands of origin peacefully or by force. Kind of the typical Nazi message. The court ruled that they couldn't be denied because of that expression of a view, because it's protected by the First Amendment, so they got a half mile of Route 160. The state of Missouri kind of had the last laugh because they put up a sign next to this neo-Nazi party sign that named that half-mile stretch as the Rabbi Abraham Herschel Memorial Highway. Well, from another perspective, yes, we have this range of views, and on one side it involves obnoxious views, dangerous views, but obviously we have a lot of other views that are very essential to making our country work. But the bottom line is, this is a complex and at times chaotic country to live in. And for some people, that's very frightening. But for others, it was a source of excitement, a source of challenge, a source of energy, a source of entertainment, a source of inspiration. Alistair Cooke, who was a correspondent for the British Broadcasting Corporation during the Second World War, he was British, he came to the United States, he broadcast back to the United Kingdom what he was seeing in America. He liked the country so much that he became an American citizen. And he said this about living in America and about American democracy. And you can see how he is comfortable with the notion that things aren't so tidy here, that they're a little messy. And he says, first, he pointed out that a lot of people despair of American society, but what's really amazing about America is, despite how big it is, how many people live here of differing backgrounds, how basically everybody gets along. Basically, it's peaceful day to day. And then he said, quote, enough is happening in America at any one time, enough that is exciting, frightening, funny, brutal, brave, intolerable, bizarre, dull, slavish, eccentric, inspiring, and disastrous. All of it's happening at the same time. That almost anything you care to say about the United States is true. You can make a case for thinking this is the best, the worst, the most abject, the most alert democracy ever invented. Now, the First Amendment and Article 6 recognize the government can't attempt to impose one type of thinking, orthodoxy, on everybody. Everybody has to accept the dictates of the Communist Party, for example. And I think implicit in that is the recognition that if that's the way you want to run a country, in the end, you only have one way to get everybody to think in the same direction and act in the same direction. And that option is violence. Robert Goldstein, a historian, commenting on the viciousness of the Russian Revolution in 1917, where many, many people were slaughtered who were of the opposing side in that revolution. And then afterwards, any political opponents were eliminated. You could say the same thing about Islamic fundamentalists in the Middle East, Christians in Bosnia, Tutsis and Hutus in Rwanda. They all resorted to slaughter as a way of eliminating opposition. And Robert Goldstein put it this way, and for that matter, let me add to the list, Hindus and Muslims in India. They have been killing each other, in some cases, in dramatic numbers. I'll spare the details and limits of time. But in 2002, India had its own 9/11, where thousands of Muslims were slaughtered by Hindus in retribution for a train that was set on fire in which about 60 Hindus were burned alive. And it was a gruesome, gruesome slaughter. They used laptops to track down the addresses where Muslims lived. It was a high-tech slaughter. Robert Goldstein put it this way: any group who seek to define people in their own rigid terms, no matter what those terms may be, doesn't make any difference what they are, who then try to force them into the mold they have conceived, are reduced at last to violence and terror as their chief weapons. This has been true throughout history and remains true today. People are entirely too complicated, too elusive, too sublimely chaotic creatures to fit into anyone's preconceived patterns. And the First Amendment in Article 6 recognize this. So we don't have the government under a constitution being able to use violence and force to have everyone conform to one way of thinking, one religious belief, one set of political expression. We are now engaged, though, and we've been engaged for years, in a struggle. Let's deal with people outside the United States who don't accept the underlying premise of this country. Since we're on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, I'll make a few references to that. Barack Obama, and this again is not a political speech, was and is a good writer, whatever you think about his policies, and I don't agree with all of them. And he wrote a preface to a book. He rewrote the preface. The book was originally published in 1994. It was an autobiography called Dreams from My Father. And then in 2004, he rewrote the preface to that book to incorporate what happened on 9/11. Of course, that was 2001, 3 years before that. And he said, I can't understand or look into the heart of the terrorists who murdered these innocent people. I just can't understand how they could do that. And then he went on to describe the struggle that we're in, and that continues up to this very day. He said this, quote, the underlying struggle we are engaged in is between those who embrace our teeming, colliding, irksome diversity while still insisting on a set of values that bind us together, and those who would seek under whatever flag or slogan or religious text a certainty and simplification that justifies cruelty towards those not like us. And that those forces are in tension to this day. Now, by protecting diversity of opinion, diversity of lifestyle, diversity of religious beliefs, and the voices of free society, yes, we're avoiding, and we hope we can continue the use of governmental force and violence to suppress the way people live and believe and worship. But it also provides an environment for progress, for an expression of human potential. People are free to pursue their own ideas. And it allows for the opportunity that a single voice will be given attention. The truth is that advances in virtually all phases of American society have come from some type of dissenters, some type of people who have something different to say. And they weren't suppressed. And as a result, new ideas were interjected. We were able to make changes, make improvements, develop new ideas, and this country's constantly renewing itself, unlike some other countries that have basically stagnated in many ways in the Middle Ages. This was a shrewd judgment of the founders to have things open like that. Now, and some people feel that this gives America a special ability to move forward and to live in a way with progress and modernization and change that other countries can't do. In 1997, a historian named Paul Johnson, he's generally viewed as a conservative historian, but he's written a number of good books, wrote this about America. Quote, "The story of America is essentially one of difficulties being overcome by intelligence and skill, by faith and strength of purpose, by courage and persistence. America is a human achievement without parallel." And he asked the question, can America rise above the injustice of its origins? And he was fully aware of the injustice of America's origins. And by its moral purpose and performance atone for them. And he said, yes, the country could, despite its troubled and in some cases horrific origins. America is a human achievement without parallel. That achievement did not come without heroic sacrifice and great sufferings, many costly failures, huge disappointments, defeats and tragedies. Many unresolved problems remain. But Americans are, above all, a problem-solving people. The emphasis is on practicality, not ideology, not practical problem-solving. They will not give up. Full of essential goodwill to each other and to all, confident in their inherent decency and their democratic skills, they will attack again and again the ills in their society until they are overcome, or at least substantially redressed. Now, would Paul Johnson say the same thing today that he said in 1997, roughly speaking, 20 plus years ago? Maybe not. I don't think this means he would change his opinion completely, but he might phrase it more cautiously. The fact is, in the last 20 years, our political process has been characterized by more rigidity, harsher language, demonizing and hateful language toward people who have differing political views or lifestyles, and at times even attempts to suppress it. Embedded in all of this was a disregard of facts, a disregard of critical information that people needed to make decisions, policy decisions, all that being undermined. There's also been signs of increasing devaluing of Article 6 in the First Amendment and what they represent with regard to the freedom of religion and freedom of expression. 2013, the state of North Carolina introduced a bill, the legislature, to make Christianity the state religion. It didn't pass. The fact that it was introduced shows no understanding of our constitutional history, or certainly no respect for it. In 2016, the state of Tennessee, the state legislature, passed a bill, it wasn't just introduced, passed a bill to make the Bible the official state book. It was vetoed by the governor. If that hadn't been a different governor, then that would have become the law in Tennessee until it would be overturned in court, perhaps. In 2021, a poll taken revealed that 20% of those polled, of the American citizens polled, they were adults, believed the United States should be an expressly Christian country with biblical teachings guiding every aspect of civil life, and that Christianity should be the national state religion. 1 out of 5. In 2021, Republican Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri, an up-and-coming in the Republican Party, said his mission is to, and these are his words, transform our society to reflect the gospel truth and lordship of Jesus Christ. If you disagree with him, you're not a real American. Given the anniversary of 9/11, I'll make a few references back to that to indicate what's sitting beneath the surface, and now, in some cases, now is surfacing in the ways that I just described, of people's lack of respect for religious freedom. They want Christianity, and for the most part, Protestant Christianity, to be the national religion. So let's look at what happened after 9/11. You all are, if you've been watching the news, even though you might have not have been aware at the time, you have to know what happened on that day. And in New York City, over 3,000 people died in the collapse of the towers, and all religions lost people in the tower collapses. So as a result, approximately a week after, a memorial service was held in Yankee Stadium. And what they did is they set up on the pitcher's mound in Yankee Stadium, and thousands of people attended, a big platform. And on that big platform, they had clerics from all of the religions who had lost people in the terrorist attack. So you had a Catholic priest, you had a Protestant minister, you had a Buddhist monk, you had an Islamic imam, you had a Jewish rabbi, you had a Hindu cleric. They were all there, and they all said prayers for the dead in this memorial service. After that service, what happened to the Protestant minister on that? He was kicked out of the church. And I can give you, I'm not going to give you the name of the denomination. I know which it is. If any want to know, I'll answer your question afterwards. But again, I'm trying to keep the tension. I don't want to step on anyone's toes. But anyway, they said, you're no longer fit to be a minister in our church, because by being on that platform, you implicitly recognize that other religions have equal status or some kind of status that deserves to be respected over our Christianity, Protestant Christianity. And that belief is sitting there in the minds of many people. After 9/11, an Islamic group wanted to build a mosque and community center called Park 51, about 4 blocks from Ground Zero. This was in the works before the attacks. There was nothing special about the neighborhood. There were, some pawn shops, and it would have been a real asset to the neighborhood, and it was a beautiful structure. Immediately, people opposed it, even though it had gone through all of the zoning approvals. And they said, well, hold it. You can't have an Islamic mosque next to Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan. And included in that were Newt Gingrich, who was formerly the Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives. You'll see him on Fox News all the time now. Said this, that building that mosque, and it was going to be a community center, by the way, open to all religions. So it would have been a real asset as a meeting place for any religion. He said, it's part of a, quote, Islamic cultural political offensive designed to undermine and destroy our civilization. And then he went on to say, quote, there should be no mosque near Ground Zero in New York so long as there are no churches or synagogues in Saudi Arabia. It was quickly pointed out what a ridiculous position that was, in the sense that, should we allow Saudi Arabia to determine how we run our country? No, we have our own set of principles, make our decisions independently based on our Constitution. We're not relying, dependent on what Saudi Arabia decides to do. But anyway, it never got built. The opposition was so fierce. Again, that's beneath the, all those views still exist. Let's go back to kind of full circle where we started. Article 6 says you've got to take an oath to the Constitution when you assume political office. The first Islamic congressperson, Keith Ellison from Minnesota, was now going to be, now there's several, but he was the first. He is going to his swearing-in ceremony. Raise your right hand. Place your, he puts his hand over the Koran. Oh my gosh, the right-wing commentary, some of the commentary will go nuts. Dennis Prager, a talk show host, he's actually a political appointee in some commission by President Bush, but anyway, he was a talk show host, said this in his program, quote, "Insofar as a member of Congress taking an oath to serve America and uphold its values is concerned, America is interested in only one book, the Bible. If you're incapable of taking an oath on that book, don't serve in Congress." Absolutely no understanding of either the underlying values of America or what the Constitution requires. Now, Keith Ellison pointed out an additional absurdity to that position. He says, well, yeah, I could have taken the oath on the Bible, but the oath would have meant nothing to me. My holy book is the Koran. If you want the oath to mean something as a sacred undertaking, it's got to be the book that I find expresses or embodies my religious faith. Also in terms of political diversity, again, I don't want to invest too much in this, but it was kind of, took me back a little bit. At some of the Trump rallies during the election and before that, and Trump basically held rallies all through his presidency, even when an election was not imminent, a presidential election. There were chants in 2019 regarding Ilhan Omar. She is also from Minnesota, also a member of Congress, also Islamic. You may have read some of her things. And she's taken some pretty bold stands that have gotten her into some hot water. She's controversial. It is what it is. But at the rallies, Trump pointed her out, some of these positions, and the crowd started yelling, "Send her back, send her back, send her back." Now, she's an American citizen. Her only offense, she wasn't a criminal, her only offense was to express a political view that was critical of the president and that they didn't like. And the way they used the language, and part of it may have been, people just getting revved up and, it's like a football game, so you kind of get caught up in the moment. They weren't really that serious. It's hard to tell. But the underlying view was not that different than the neo-Nazi party, and that is use government to expel her from the country. Force, get her out. And it's not just religion, it's diversity. As I just pointed out, it's often diversity of opinion and lifestyle. And there appears to be, when it comes to opinion, political dialogue, etc., less interest in, less respect for fair-minded, fact-based political debate. And there are like several, maybe 3 mutually reinforcing problems at work here. One, more and more, you hear voters, commentators on television, political candidates, office holders, including ones in high positions, articulating views which ignore or distort the facts. Basically, they start out, and this is on both sides of the political spectrum, they start out with a set of conclusions, and then frequently based on their political biases, and then they work backwards from the conclusion to try to find some way to justify the conclusion. And if they can't find actual facts, then they'll distort the facts or ignore the facts that undermine their view. They basically ignore the truth. When Obama was in office, his critics, everything Obama did, everything, was viewed as wrong or was to be criticized. When George W. Bush was in office, from the other, everything George Bush did was wrong, even though, and they never took a look at the specifics of a particular policy position. They started out with the conclusion, I hate George W. Bush, now I'm going to find a way to justify that view. And the same thing for Obama. And you could say the same thing with regard to almost every president, and that includes Trump, too, as well as Biden. Now, some extremists in the current, I'll just give you an example, and again, I'm trying not to be political, but I'm trying to make my points specific so that you can understand how they apply to a real-life situation. In the current civil rights controversy, and I know I may be wandering into a swamp here, but just hear me out. Assert that there's been no important change in American society with regard to race relations over the years. American society is just as racist, this is the allegation, as it was in the 1960s, or for that matter, in the 1860s. And these are on a certain edge, the far edge of a spectrum. I'm not saying all, and don't misread what I'm saying, because Black Lives Matter movement has many, many valid points to make, and racism is still an issue in the United States. That's not my point here, and it needs to be addressed. The question is, how do you go about addressing those racist issues? Do you take an extreme position that ignores the facts or distorts the facts and tries to blow by the facts? And that makes the debate difficult. That position ignores, that where we were in the 1960s, where we are now. We have laws on the books all across this country preventing discrimination in employment in public accommodations. Is it always observed, enforced with the vigor that you'd hope? Maybe not, but it's enforced in many cases, and it's made a huge change in this country. I'm old enough to remember when Black people could not travel in the United States by car, for example, and have any idea whether or not they could stay in a hotel at night. They would try to check in, and they'd say, sorry, there'd be one car in the parking lot, sorry, we're full. And and restaurants could refuse service to Black people. That's all changed in my lifetime. We've had a Black president and a Black first lady, who, by the way, during his term, Obama consistently had approval ratings above 50%. Obviously, we have a vice president of color. We have a Black Republican senator from South Carolina. We have numerous minority members in Congress, representatives in particular senators. We have Black mayors in Kansas City, Chicago, Baltimore, Boston, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., and numerous other cities. Many cities have Black chiefs of police, and the list goes on. The point is, you can't overstate the case when you're trying to find solutions to the racism that exists, but many people do that. Remember, I'm taking shots at both the right and left here. The next problem, as bad as ignoring or distorting facts may be, we are now facing an even worse problem. People are creating stories which they know are false, and other people are believing them without any apparent judgment or skepticism. One of the most egregious recent examples, and again, you'd say, well, yeah, these are whack jobs, but they actually have followings, and people do stuff based on this information. What happened in 2016? On the internet, starting around November, there started to be a story put out that there was a place called Comet Ping Pong Pizza in Washington, D.C., a pizza parlor, that its basement was being used for a pedophile sex ring, children put in sexual slavery, run by Hillary Clinton. And it quickly found traction on text, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, and the pizza parlor started to receive hundreds of threats. And then, because of this, let me just interject. The allegation was clearly false. The pizza place didn't even have a basement, if you want to start there. But obviously the rest of it was, but people believed it. And so in December of 2016, a 28-year-old man named Edgar Welch entered the pizza parlor with an AR-15 and shot up the place. He believed the story. We don't even have to go to Washington, D.C. Alex Jones, who has a podcast, InfoWars, many of you have heard of him, has taken the position or multiplied the view, broadcast the view, that the 26 people who died, children and teachers, in the shooting at Sandy Hook, Connecticut, didn't die, never happened. That's what he put out on the internet. And that the parents who were interviewed, the grieving parents who were interviewed of the dead children, they were actors, hired to, and this was all an effort to, by the gun control advocates, to provide a basis for enacting gun control legislation. The 26 never died. Clearly false. People believed it. And the parents, in addition to having to suffer the loss of a child, an elementary school child, now are getting death threats from the people who read this. With regard to the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol, there are now claims from Trump supporters, and largely believed, that those really weren't Trump supporters. They kind of have an inconsistent position on this, but anyway, this is what they're putting out there. That what the riot was a group of leftist extremists called Antifa who rioted at the Capitol to make Trump look bad. Clearly false. And of course, all of this, people putting out false stories, is made worse by the internet. Kurt Anderson, writing an article titled, "Has America Lost Its Mind?" Said, quote, "Among the web's 1 billion sites, believers in anything and everything can find thousands of fellow believers in fantasy. Before the internet, crackpots were mostly isolated. Now their opinions are all over the airwaves and the web, just like actual news. Now all fantasies look real." And you add into that mix, remember there are countries outside the United States who hope that the experiment fails. And so they're doing their best to contribute to that process. So we now know that the Russians and the Chinese are posting fake internet accounts with fake internet stories that they know will be flashpoints and that people will get all worked up about. That's the whole point of what they're doing. So I've been asked, when I've given this speech before, well, so you have all this false information in the internet, distorted information, and how do you sort your way through it? Can I give you a nice, neat formula for separating the wheat from the chaff, finding truth among all the lies? And no, I can't. I can only tell you what I do, and do with it in your turn what you will. A couple of things I do. One is I refer to professional journalists for my information. These are reporters for established news organizations, the so-called wire services. They don't use wires anymore, but AP, Associated Press, reporters for the New York Times, Washington Post, those are more liberal, the Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, they're more conservative. But I look at what the reporters are writing, not what's on the opinion page, not on the editorial page. That's something different. Now you can get some information from there, but that's not where I look for my source of factual news. The commentators that you'll find on television, I also looked for the network news reporters, ABC, CBS, NBC, and the Fox News reporters, not the commentators. Fox has some journalists who are professional journalists, Chris Wallace being the most notable, Brett Baer being the other one, who are professional journalists, and they're reporting factual information in large measure. When you get to the nighttime commentators, they're there to be controversial, to draw an audience, to sell advertising, to be in, and to reach out to their demographic audience. They're not concerned with journalistic factual reporting. That's not their gig. In fact, when Rush Limbaugh was confronted, he was on the radio for many years as a conservative commentator. He was confronted with the assertion that his show was presenting false information. He responded that he was not a journalist, but instead he was an entertainer and shouldn't be held accountable to journalistic standards. Well, now you know that, and I know that, so I don't rely on that source of commentary for much of my factual information. I refer, next point, to the findings of official bodies who are tasked with trying to find out the truth in any situation. Now, typically, in many cases, that's going to be court rulings, where a court is assigned the task of getting to the bottom of something. What's the truth? And issuing a ruling based on the evidence presented. But it also might be the findings of a commission, a special commission, or a Secretary of State, or an official governmental person whose job it is to report the truth. Now, these sources are important, but are they subject to biases of some kind or another that could kind of work their way into findings or reporting? Sure. So the third suggestion I have, or suggest, it's not a suggestion, third suggestion of what I do, you can do with it what you will, is I try to think for myself, try to get some information of my own that allows me to assess what I'm reading, because all these, even the good sources I talked about, are subject to some biases, omissions that could affect the objectivity of the reporting. So I try to use my common sense and try to drill down a little bit beneath the headlines or the 2-minute news summaries, and I reserve a conclusion until I can learn more. John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, said, "You have to be willing to experience some discomfort that comes from thinking as opposed to the easy comfort that can come from holding a simple-minded opinion." There's a difference between just holding an opinion and thinking about it. So, again, I hesitate to wander into this. In the limits of time, actually, I won't. I was going to explain how I've applied these approaches to a specific issue in front of us. Instead, I'm going to go to the third element of what's making things difficult now. The first two was distorting and ignoring the facts. The second was creating false information, which is even worse. The third of what's happening now is people's attempts to suppress opposing views. Actually prevent an opposing view from being expressed. In September 2017, Antifa, this radical left-wing group, 100 people in ski masks, black ski masks, attacked a peaceful pro-Trump demonstration in Berkeley, California, tried to beat the crap out of them. They justified their actual violence because they said the words used by the conservative speakers were in essence acts of violence. They equated their real violence with somebody using words. Obviously, that's a dangerous formula, if you will, and I think I'd submit a ridiculous formula, because then every opposing view, if it's viewed as an act of violence, is justification for a fight or for a violent attack. Spring of 2017, at Middlebury College up in Vermont, students engaged in a violent protest to prevent a conservative speaker from talking. And they succeeded. Couldn't speak. For that matter, Governor Lamont recently, this is August of 2021, is at a meeting in Cheshire, and they're going to talk about COVID strategies and masks and vaccine, and he was there with public officials. And there was an opportunity for the community to comment critically and challenge him. That wasn't good enough. A group of people, anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers, took over the meeting, shouted him down, wouldn't let him talk, stopped the meeting. They wanted to repress an opposing view. Wesleyan University, my alma mater, 2016. There was an opinion article in the Wesleyan Argus, a school newspaper, in response to Black Lives Matter. There was an opinion article, it wasn't a reporting article, just on the editorial page, an opinion. And the opinion of the writer was entitled, "All Lives Matter," not dismissing Black Lives Matter totally, but trying to broaden the, by the way, that was a very typical response of some people, that all lives matter. What was the response on the left? They gathered up all the newspapers all across campus and destroyed them, burned them. Then they went and insisted that the newspaper be defunded, shut down, because they had the gall to put out an opinion with which these other people disagreed with on the left. Now these, what I just described, are not technically First Amendment violations because it wasn't the government doing it. But these are private citizens, and their response was totally inconsistent with the values underlying the First Amendment. Obviously, and you can guess my view, that free expression of opinion, free exercise of religion, respect for the truth is essential to our democracy. George Orwell said, quote, "The further a society drifts from the truth, the more it will hate those who speak it." The First Amendment, in particular, is intended, among other things, to protect the truth tellers. Now, I admit there's nothing in the First Amendment, nothing in Article 6 that requires us to think clearly, requires any of you to think clearly. There's nothing that requires you to respect the truth. It's not in the language. There's nothing that requires you to listen carefully to others in hopes that by listening to others, and this is another reason why it's been great for a modern society allowed to reform itself, improve itself, is that you might learn something very valuable from someone other than yourself. There's nothing that requires that to be in place, although that, I think over the years that's been largely the result. Nevertheless, we owe it to Article 6, we owe it to the First Amendment to, when necessary, experience the discomfort that comes from thinking, of listening to others different from ourselves, respecting others different from ourselves, searching for the truth even if it undermines some of our own beliefs. And we should be willing to protect the rights of all citizens in their search for the truth and their search to find their own religious faith. Through blood, sweat, and tears. That's not just a rock group. Through blood, sweat, and tears, and that's really what it was. Prior generations of Americans have given us an incredible gift of a free, diverse society. We should feel grateful that we were able to participate in this extraordinary experiment, this extraordinary gamble. And we should be grateful that it's gotten us this far. Now, every one of us should recognize that we, each in our own individual ways, we conduct ourselves and interact with other people, are custodians, are guardians of this inheritance. And we should do our part to ensure that the experiment continues. Anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all here today. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Either, I don't know, I think whether time would permit that, I'll stay around afterwards if you want to come up, and happy to answer any questions.